This segment has been brought to you by Tropical Creatives. Authors, get your books promoted today. Before we get into today's interview, hear a little bit about the book from the author themselves.
Think you can't fall in love with a robot? Get swept away in a darkly whimsical, sci-fi, and steampunk retelling of historic events during the Spanish-American War, and find yourself lost in the seduction by a man who may not be a man at all. Andújar, the Robot Gentleman of San Juan, is now at Barnes & Noble's, Walmart.com, and Amazon.
Greetings, listenership. Welcome to TLC, Tropical Literature Creatives, the podcast where we interview authors of Caribbean heritage about themselves and about their literary works. Some of them you've heard of, and some of them you'll be hearing about soon enough. Today, we have with us the caring Carolina Cardona, author of the book Andújar, the Robot Gentleman of San Juan. Carolina, welcome to Tropical Literature Creatives.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to all your listeners. I'm excited to discuss romance, scientific discoveries, fiction, and anything you can think of in between.
That is fantastic, because in particular, as Valentine's Day is right around the corner, you were interested in this particular romance novel that you would have done, this combination of both romance and science fiction. But before I get into the book, there's a scenario that I usually try to give to persons. Imagine we encounter each other at the airport in Puerto Rico for the first time. I'm coming to Puerto Rico and I don't know what to try. I don't know where to go. What would you recommend that I try? What place would you recommend I would go, or what food you would recommend that I partake of if I were to come to Puerto Rico?
So originally, when you first get to Puerto Rico, you're typically entering through the city of San Juan. So I would say that your first stop definitely has to be Old San Juan. It is really our historic World Heritage Site. It is a walled city, meaning it was a defensive city, meaning a lot of people wanted to get in. And there's a reason. Not only was this a very strategic city, and that's why it was very well defended, but it really is a treasure trove. It is really a historic, beautiful enclave where you can just trace back everything that is relevant about Puerto Rico in that small space. There are beautiful museums, beautiful hotels, amazing food. The pina colada was invented there. So everything about Puerto Rico can be traced back to that small city. And then it's not a big island, so it's 100 by 35 miles. There's a lot to discover. You can actually spend a lifetime there and not really get to see everything. But for a tourist, I would say it is an accessible place that you can really travel from one beach to another beautiful beach really easily. But San Juan, definitely. And for your first dish, I would try anything with mofongo in it. It's a mashed plantain, garlic, and cilantro mix of just goodness and heaven in your palate. And it's usually stuffed with either pork, steak, but my favorite is fish. Seafood is big. Seafood is big.
No, if it is that you choose to, diversify from just being an author and doing little short, promotions where traveling is concerned, I think that you'd be fairly successful in that particular field as well, because I'm interested.
Yeah, I was a travel writer and a magazine writer for a long time, so you're not going to be surprised to find a lot of travel intention in my writing, because that's where I make my living, most of the time. So
okay, interesting. In terms of the book Andújar, tell us a little bit about it for persons who don't know and who are tuning into the podcast for the very first time.
So Andújar, the Robot Gentleman of San Juan, is essentially a steampunk and science fiction retelling of events during the Spanish-American War in 1898. I started to write, and interestingly enough, the roots of this novel is romance. I wanted to write a paranormal romance. I was covering San Diego Comic-Con as a journalist, and back in the day, and I was covering Marvel and Halo and the big video games, those big properties. And then I discovered that if you go to Comic-Con, you can actually have industry people evaluate your scripts or evaluate your writing. And I decided that, okay, I'm coming here as a journalist, but I really want to come with a project. And the novel Twilight was big at the time. Vampires, sparkly vampires were big. And I knew I didn't want to write about vampires, but I wanted to write maybe something gothic. And I always think, like, coming from the Caribbean, it's not the first place that comes to mind when you're talking about gothic stories. So I wanted to kind of change that and have the Caribbean participate in settings and genres that are not necessarily associated with the Caribbean. But I wanted to, I really was always very interested in the Spanish American War. And as I did more research about this period, what was going on at the time, historically and culturally in the Caribbean, I kind of started to step away from the whole paranormal thing, because the whole agro-industrial setting in the Caribbean around the 1890s and 1880s kept pointing to me kept pushing me more towards a post-industrial era.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I started to see more of that industrial presence. And the more I did research about this, about the era, this is why even in Comic-Con, I started to see people dressing up as steampunk. And I didn't know what steampunk was. And as I mentioned to you, I study English literature, and I was a big Gothic and Victorian literature fan. So to see people dressed as Victorians, but for some reason they had jetpacks and laser guns and time traveling machines, I became very intrigued by this. And as I'm writing the story, these steampunk cosplayers start coming to my mind. I'm like, yeah, this isn't paranormal. I think with all this agro-industrial and innovation and things that are happening in this era, this is industrial, this is science, this is steampunk. And that when that word came to mind, I started to put everything together. And when I thought about my main character, I wanted to kind of focus on this mysterious, almost sickly kind of character that needed prosthetics. And then as I kept thinking about those prosthetics and the world of steampunk and the world of industrial advancement started to come to me, I'm like, this is kind of a cyborg, weird mesh for this character is very interesting to me. And just kept kind of chasing that premise until I came up with the steampunk robot automaton figure. And I'm like, how cool would it be to write a romance story, but not focus on that late 19th century elegant poetic dandy, put a stiff robot man in the middle of it and see what happens. And that's kind of the premise of the story.
Okay. I mean, it's not your conventional, love story. There's no, it's not what we're accustomed to, which is kind of what makes it interesting for me.
Definitely not what you were interested in, and it's definitely not what you expect. And I always wanted to sort of pose that question to the reader when writing a story, is like, do you think you can fall in love with a robot? Like, that is essentially the question being asked of the reader with the novel. And it's always interesting to find out the answer from the readers who have read it.
No, and it's a really timely question because of the age that we live in and the technology that we find ourselves exposed to. ChatGPT is a thing, as well as other artificial intelligence platforms. So it just seems timely, the novel that you'd have written kind of coincides with the times that we live in. So it's interesting. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I wrote it in 2020, and here we are, 2024. Some of us using ChatGPT on a daily basis for either work or other projects. And there's a question of whether that should be part of your creative process. And a lot of people have different opinions about it. I personally don't like to mix creativity with the robot. I think it is useful for other things, or it's on its way to being very useful. But a lot of people certainly have embraced it, and it's an interesting time to debate these things and how much AI is seeping into our lives. And I think the robot boyfriend and robot girlfriend are not that far away, I don't think.
No, I agree with you that it's a lot closer than we think.
Yes, it is.
But having said these things, how has the reception been for the book?
So it's interesting because I worked in the publishing industry before I decided to publish a novel, and because I worked in the publishing industry, I wanted to go indie.
Mm-hmm.
And I published this novel right when the pandemic hit. I published it in May of 2020,
Mm-hmm.
and all the author events went away. We were all home. And I said, well, this is a great time for people to read. It's also not a great time to be promoting something. Um, so what I did was I started to connect, because this was a steampunk novel. I started there. I started with the fandom of steampunk. And I started meeting steampunk creators via social media. I started introducing myself. And then what was interesting is that these groups, they stopped getting together in person. And steampunk events are known for being very much about the cosplay and the costumes and the props. So now these meetings were kind of moving towards a virtual space. And in the virtual space, it's a little more challenging to showcase things that are so craft oriented or theatrically oriented. But it was kind of an awesome place to be an author and talk about your book. So that's kind of how I started. I started going to these meetings with steampunk folks and kind of talking about the book. And then some of the events started to happen more online. I kept getting invited, and then introducing myself as well. The other angle was teachers. So English teachers went virtual that year. And it was another challenging time for teachers to have material to show on camera, because teaching, it's a different dynamic when you're teaching in person versus virtually. So a lot of them were like, okay, so you have a book. Okay, let's talk about creative writing. Let's talk about the novel. So I started actually talking to a lot of high schoolers and some college campuses, like, who had virtual meetings. So you can say with this book, the reception was that the pandemic hurt and actually helped the book a lot. And I find that the premise itself has gotten a lot of attention, and it's fantastic. But the best encounters all happen in person. I take the book to a book fair, or I take the book to an art fair, and I bring the robot with me, or a festival. And little by little, it's become known in the steampunk community. I've made a really big community there, so much so that my next book, I wanted to write a straight up science fiction novel.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm like, I would be sad not to be a part of the steampunk community with this next book. So I am restructuring it and rewriting it in a way that incorporates a steampunk element, even though it is not a steampunk book per se. So the community has been key for this book. Absolutely.
No, and I like how you mentioned the community a lot, because I think as authors sometimes that's one of the things that we discredit. I mean, it's one thing to have skill and to have talent. However, when it is that you find yourself in certain spaces and you're able to showcase your works, persons are made aware as to what it is that you're offering. And when they know what you're offering, they in turn can share with other persons as well. I like your approach. How it is you went to Comic-Con. On one hand to, do work, but at the same time to have your pitch there as well. So you're out there and your work is being showcased and it is growing. Um, you
Yeah.
mentioned you mentioned that you had a background in travel and you also do worked in the publishing industry. Uh, you're not a full-time author?
No, no. So my career has I've always made money writing. I've made a living writing. I'm very lucky that way. I started with magazines. Then I moved on to custom publishing. So I worked with the Miami Herald, and they had a custom publishing division. So prior to the Miami Herald, I was with fashion magazines. I was with in English and Spanish. So I worked with a very famous Spanish magazine called Vanidades. Was huge. And then I moved on from there to work with regional luxury publishing on a magazine called Ocean Drive, Español.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, so I collaborated with different publications, and then I ended up kind of working freelance for different tourism destination publications. Until then, I became an editor and started doing the books for the Greater Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau. So then I had a brief stint in television. I worked in program editing for NBC Universal, and now I moved into marketing for destinations and hotels. So my narrative has always been about promoting and setting all my writing in beautiful places, especially the Caribbean and Latin America. So you can never separate the two for me. I mean, even if I write science fiction or if I write paranormal, it's going to be in a beautiful place, because that's where I make my living and where I have been polishing and honing my skills.
No, I see, because a lot of persons would have started writing in school and, it would have grown, into something else. But you're mentioning all the places that you work, all the opportunities that you've had to write. I guess it just seems natural writing. When I say natural, the amount of time that you find yourself exposed to writing, when the time came to write a book, you'd have been doing it so much, it would not have been difficult for you.
Right, because from 9 to 5 I'm writing, and then my hobby is writing. So I'm constantly working at it and working on it. So and it's joyful. I that's where I recharge, and I'm doing other things, and I could be doing a million other things, but writing is where I feel at peace and where I recharge my batteries, for sure.
Okay. You mentioned that you had background in marketing, and you also mentioned when it is that you go to promote your book, you quotey fingers, you bring the robot along. Um, do you have any other creative means or that means or methods that you use to promote the book in addition to the robot?
So I try to. We're at a very interesting time as writers, because the whole dynamic of writing has changed, and not so much it has changed. I think we're waking up to things that have always been done, but we've always had this idea that writing is a lonely profession, that the writer is all alone in a beautiful room, locking the world out, having their meals delivered, a la Ernest Hemingway. And and some writers were more of a recluse, others were having adventures. But when it came to writing, it was the writer alone in the book and the words. And we are waking up to the fact that no, Shakespeare was a huge theater marketer. He was always trying to get his plays set and have theaters showcase his plays. Charles Dickens, huge self-marketer. But we always have this very romantic idea of the writer, and that has not been true. And now that there's social media, we're all expressing the need for writers to not just be writers, but also be the people who are promoting and finding angles from their books that will appeal to others. And there's a lot of this discussion happening, a lot of pushback against it, because a lot of writers are introverted, so they don't like that. For me, it made a lot of sense. I do have a little bit of a background also in theater. So steampunk, because the steampunk is so theatrical, I try to access that side of me and understand that if I go to a steampunk event with a book, I'm going to be competing with people who have costumes, who have props, who have these insanely mechanical and artful creations. So people who are attending these things are already going to be stimulated by these beautiful machine, type of creations. So I have to compete with that. And then the way that I did was I came up with the Tropical Eccentric, which is a steampunk person who sets their stories in the Caribbean. So right away, I'm going to look different. I'm going to have the brown and the black sort of outfits that are Victorian, but I'm going to stick a bunch of these flowers, like these Hawaiian and tropical flowers in my outfit. I'm going to have a lot of color. So I'm already going to look different. And then speaking of the robot, I started to kind of get interested in cosplay because I was going to Comic-Con and I wanted to be sort of part of this pop culture thing. Anime has made cosplay like huge. You can't be blind to these. Nothing is happening in a vacuum. You have to kind of understand what the culture, what your cultural moment is. So I know that I'm going to be competing with these very visual interactive things. But the main thing is, and I could bring a robot, I could bring three robots with me. The main thing I think that has helped me is that I never approach this as the writer who's going to sell a book. I'm not a writer who's here to sell a book. I'm here for a reader who wants an interesting story. So I immediately make it about the reader. I ask the readers questions. I engage with them when they're walking by. What are you doing? What is your day like? What are you enjoying? So I think that readers respond to that better than me just kind of coming in and say, hey, I read this awesome book. I'm so talented. That everybody thinks that. Everybody's selling something. But when you approach it and make it about the reader at every turn, I think that people will respond to that a lot better. And when I started, I haven't been doing marketing that long, actually. I'm going to be in my third year because I was doing editorial before this. But marketing and editorial kind of intersect in that same message. It is about the buyer and it is about the reader. It is about appealing to their need first. And I think that's what's going to make, I've been successful when I hone in on that message more.
You mentioned that you mentioned that you have a lot of skills there. I mean, obviously your background in writing, you've been doing editing. You said you've been doing marketing for about 3 years. Do you see yourself doing any additional studies to help you in terms of marketing and promoting your book or your works going forward?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what we were saying about the writing scene. The author is no longer a lone read. The author is not just interacting with their time, but with other authors. Like there are platforms right now where authors go to sometimes to vent and sometimes to promote. But while you're there and you're making these connections, you're also getting so much wisdom and so much insight from things that have worked and have helped people. What works better, what doesn't give you quite the same return. So I do sometimes some little courses, especially with TikTok, something that I have been very, very reluctant about, and a lot of authors are very, very anti-TikTok or book talk. So I've been trying to kind of get a little insight. I don't like to get invested in one particular platform, only because we've seen that these platforms have their day, and then to get invested in the one or putting all your efforts toward one in particular, it's not for me. So I do try to get a little tidbits here and there to help me overcome whatever hang up I may have about them. So yeah, I do. It doesn't look like sitting at a course, sitting through a course in a university for me. It is more about interacting with other publishing professionals and listening to them.
The book that you would have written, what would your thoughts be about that book being converted either into a movie or to a short television series, taken up by Netflix or something? What would your thoughts be on something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think most writers would be super cool with that idea. I do believe though that the novel is the novel. I think there's a trend, and it's natural for that to be this way. Like in early films used to have prologues, written prologues, because they were influenced by literature and novels. Now you see a lot of writers try to write their books like they're movies, and it flips. But as somebody who studied, English literature, I very much believe that a novel is a novel. It's its own medium, and I think a skillful director can turn it into something very cinematic and beautiful. I would love someone like Guillermo del Toro. I think he's the kind of person that, the kind of creative that I dream about, because his body of work resembles a lot what I write and my vision of things. The early Tim Burton movies as well. So Tim is also a dream come true. But I do believe that a novel, it's its own beast. It's its own playground, a place to play with language. I love the idea of every reader creates their own interpretation of the novel. When you have a movie, it's that director's vision, and everybody kind of, they either love it or hate it, or they participate in it. But for me, there's nothing more magical than giving a reader something that becomes a world of their own making. So yeah.
With your background in English language, in English literature, what would your thoughts be on your book being adopted by the education system to help persons with their reading and their comprehension skills?
I would like it included in a place like Puerto Rico, for example, only because I feel growing up, and this may be your experience in the Caribbean as well. Our education teaches us to see literature as something that is very high-minded, that concerns itself with history and social issues and serious things. And we were never taught any science fiction. We weren't taught any gothic or paranormal or horror. We were taught to kind of see those genres as less than. And even though my book certainly has literary aspirations and it is based on historic events, it is a science fiction steampunk book. So I would like it included as part of a sign that our curriculum is evolving and we are giving kids opportunities to read things that they really like. And if they like superhero comics, if they like Japanese manga, like create a space for those works to be included and give kids sort of a passion for reading and understand the context of our canon and our literary works and our great works of literature, but also give them the space for things that are more fun to read and that they're interested in.
I think you already answered the question I'm going to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway to see if you give a different answer. In the times that we live in, a lot more persons are a lot less interested in reading than they used to be. What would your advice be to encourage parents to have their children read a bit more?
I think you have to take away the phone. I really do. I think you have to, as a parent, limit the phone and say you get X amount of hours of this during the day. And it's very tough. I'm a parent. I do understand that schools now and teaching requires your kid to have a phone. I delayed when my kids were going to get phones, and the complaint was, yes, they want to have their playtime, gorilla tag and whatever with their friends, but it's like my teacher says I need to take screenshots of this for homework. So our school system is becoming dependent on the phone. And in the US, phones are a security reason because we have the unfortunate reality of school shootings and that kind of thing to worry about. But when the kids are home with you, let them be bored. Let them, of course, absolutely let them be bored. Let them have a space when they have no choice than to use their imagination. And maybe they'll pick up the book. That would be awesome. And if your kids really are into manga or something like this, and you're like, no, but that's not Anne of Green Gables, buy them the manga. The important thing is for them to create a habit of reading, of sitting quietly and having a text spur their imagination. I think that's ultimately the goal.
Okay. Right now we're getting close to February the 14th, which is Valentine's Day or right around the world. As the author of this book, and which is a romance book, what is your favorite romance novel?
I stick to the classics, man. I do. I am the Jane Eyre type of reader, but I would say the more contemporary authors. I love a book called Phantom by Susan Kay, and it sounds like and it sounds like fanfic, that I'm not going to knock fanfic. A lot of people have issues with fan fiction, but this is a retelling of the story of the Phantom of the Opera by this English author named Susan Kay. I read that novel when I was, I would say 15, 16, and it absolutely, like, it is down, my favorite, hands down, my favorite book. The problem with the romance genre, calling something a romance genre, is that if you call it romance, the expectation from romance readers is that it's going to have a happy ending. So if your novel has any sort of an ambiguous ending, or they don't end up together, and you call it a romance, you're going to get a lot of backlash. So there's a big debate about what is romance and what is romantic fiction, or a book with romantic elements. So for Andújar, I call it a science fiction and steampunk novel with a strong romantic element, but the core is a romance story, but the law of the genre forbids me from calling it a romance novel. And Susan Case is the same deal. It's a Phantom of the Opera. We all know how the story ends. So
All right. That pretty much brings us to the end of our interview at this time. Carolina, thank you very much for making yourself available to be interviewed and to share a little bit about your book, about yourself with listeners, because we're all more better for it.
Kevin, thank you so much, and for promoting writing in the Caribbean, and I want to extend an invitation to any of your listeners who are considering writing, who are from the Caribbean, to do it, to connect with each other. We need more of our fiction out there, and taking center stage for sure.
Okay, well said, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to TLC, Tropical Literature Creators. If you've heard something of interest or something you like, reach out to us. Reach out to our authors. Follow us on social media. We look forward to hearing from you.